Hi, and welcome to the Deer IQ podcast, where smart hunting begins. I'm Adam Lewis, and we're wrapping up our deer science deep dive with this bonus session on scent control, how it actually works. We'll look at the science and the bias, the facts and the fiction, and come to a science-based, reasonable conclusion as to if it's actually possible to beat a deer's nose. So, here's the top things to look for during this special episode. What is the known science of the capabilities of a whitetail's sense of smell, and what is just assumption and conjecture? What is the strawman argument when it comes to the debate on being scent-free? What do dog tests really reveal about a deer's sense of smell and ability to detect a hunter? What are 2 reasons just playing the wind may not be a good idea? What is the real standard for scent control, and how is this different than most think? And what are keys to implementing a regimen to actually beat a deer's nose? And there's a whole lot more good stuff in there, so let's get to the podcast and up your deer IQ. All right, so let's dive in here and take a look at scent control and try to break down the science and the bias and separate the two, how you tell the difference. There's a lot of opinions out there and thoughts on this, and I think it gets really cloudy when you're trying to differentiate the science, the actual stuff we know versus the stuff people think versus some wild ideas, right? And so I'll try to break that down, and we'll look at if I personally think you should use one of these spray bottle things or this other thing that was on the thumbnail. If you're on YouTube, this thing here, I'll reveal what this is and really some of my opinions on some of these things. And I'll try to be clear what is really based off science and what is opinion. And I'm going to try to steer us toward actual science data and how we should interpret maybe some of this. So let's first start with the science background, what we actually do know and what we don't about how deer smell. So we do know that deer have about 300 million, I think the number is 297 million olfactory receptors. These are the receptors in the nose, nasal cavities that, help anything smell, right? So deer have almost 300 million of those. We have about 5 million, and that's 60x more. That's a 60x difference. So it can be assumed at the least deer can smell 60 times better than us. They also have larger nasal passages where these olfactory receptors are. That helps them, just volume-wise to take in more air and more scent. And they do have a larger area of the brain to process scent more than us humans. So we know those things, and it's been put out there. I think this is from MSU Deer Lab down there, that 500 to 1,000 times better than us is what deer can smell. That's a big variance. It'd be safe to say at least hundreds of times better, but that's kind of what we know. And it's also been thrown out there quite a bit scientifically that they believe they can differentiate better than we can different smells that are put together. They can separate those out. So we do know that let's just assume from the science they can smell hundreds of times better than us. That'd be a safe assumption. But beyond that, we don't really totally know. So that's what we need to understand. And I saw a clip of something a while back, a podcast of a scientist saying something about their smelling gets exponential. And that's hard to say when we don't have any hard data and be able to look at that on a graph or some sort of mathematical curve. So you have to be careful when you're listening to scientists if they're actually looking at data or if they're just making projections or their opinions getting thrown in there. I'd say that's an opinion. There was no data, because if you're saying we can't really totally measure this, but then you're saying it's exponential, there's no way you can have both. So be careful when you hear those things. What I said was just what we kind of know. They obviously smell much better than us. So at this point, this is where it breaks down for hunters, and you have people saying, if that's the case, then we can't beat their sense of smell. So I'm going to, just play the wind. That's the safest thing I can do. I'm going to just do that. And then you have another camp saying the same data, the same thing, saying, well, if deer smell that good, I'm going to do whatever I can, and I'm going to have to really up my game to try to beat that, to try to minimize my scent. And so that's two different thoughts based on the same information. And so I want to kind of break down both of those avenues and what, again, is reality and what isn't. So let's look at the just play the win crowd. And if this is you, don't be offended here, but let's just be honest about this. In my opinion, this is not the best route to go. But here's the assumptions behind this, and this is important. The assumption here is that to defeat a deer's sense of smell, to not be winded, to not have deer know we're hunting them, to not have that happen, we need to eliminate all odors coming from us. I mean, every single one. Not even a cell could, slough off our skin and get on the wind and enter a deer's nose. Nothing. We'd have to eliminate all. We'd have to be scent free. And this is where this terminology is kind of important and also dangerous, because I don't think it's accurate. Okay, so people might say, well, we can't be totally scent free, on this microscopic, this really small level. It's impossible to eliminate 100% of scent, so why even try? And I would say that's a straw man argument. It's setting up an impossible thing and saying, yep, we can't do it, so therefore my argument stands. And I really think that's bad logic in science. Let's, for example, take the dog test. There's been tests out there to see if different products work and if dogs can find humans under boxes in a field. And at first glance, it looks like a pretty good idea. Well, dogs can smell real good. If they can find hunters that are putting on these sprays or using whatever, then, that must translate to deer. But here's a couple problems with that to think about. First of all, a dog is not a deer. These are different species. And one of them is a predator and one is a prey species. That is very, very different. We're trying to say they're basically the same. They're not at all. Also, the situation is very different. That is a very set up situation where the dogs are trained to find people. These are like trained like canines. And they know there's a human somewhere out there hiding, right? So it's a very set up situation. They can see the boxes. They know that a human's out there somewhere. They just have to find them. And it's a totally different animal, and it's not a hunting situation. So for me, that does not translate at all. Until we can get some sort of test with deer that's very scientific in, one of these labs at Georgia or University of Mississippi, which I'll throw this out there. You guys should try this. That's, very scientific. That dog one just doesn't fly with me. And I think also that playing the wind is bad for a couple of reasons if you actually understand how smart deer operate. First, when you play the wind, if that's your mantra, if that's your attitude, then that allows for scent on the landscape. There's two ways we can leave scent the deer can smell. That is by contact, things we touch and leave the scent behind, brush, grasses, anything really we touch out in the woods, and then on the air, right? And so if you're just playing the wind, you're opening up and leaving all that scent on the ground and not even addressing it. That's a problem. And secondly, it doesn't address at all how mature deer or smart deer are going to move. Deer that have had experiences with hunters, they want to move when things are in their favor as much as possible. So if you are always having the wind in your favor, it's directly in your face, then it's never going to be in the deer's favor. And that's a problem because the deer want to move when things are in their favor and they feel safe. And so by setting it up perfect for you, you're never setting it up perfect for them. They're not going to feel safe to move. And you're not going to get near as many encounters as if you think in terms of them and what's good for them. And so playing the wind really shoot yourself in the foot, in my opinion, based on those things. And these are just logical. Think through these things here, right? So you want to reverse those things. You don't want to leave scent on the landscape, and you want to try to actually give them the wind. But if you're not practicing or trying to practice any scent control type things, that's hard to do. So I think there's a lot of bias or maybe myth behind this idea of being scent free. And we should really not use that word, because that is a word that's, again, it's impossible, right? But here's the key. Is that what we need to do? Do we need to be scent free? Or is the bar much lower than that to still be successful? So last year I wrote an article for North American Whitetail, and you can look it up, about a scent control regimen. And I think it was called a scent-free case study. And in that article, I quoted Dr. Carl Miller from the University of Georgia when I talked to him. And this is important. I want to read an excerpt from this because I think this is the key when we look at this issue and topic. And he said this: there's an odor threshold above which deer adversely react and below which they do not. Basically, even though they can smell better in all these ways, there is a finite value to that. Their smelling ability is not infinite. There's a line in the sand, and if your odors are above that, the number of molecules that reach their nose, they'll smell you. If it's below that, they will not adversely react, and that's the key. Will they adversely react or not? Change their course? Will they start stomping and snorting and things like that? Or will they continue on their normal activities? There's a certain amount or threshold. All we have to do is be below that. And scientists don't know what that is. We don't know what that is, but really that doesn't matter. We just need to figure out, can we get below that? Not eliminate all scent, but can we get below that threshold? And then we basically have beat a deer's nose, which is the question. Can you beat a deer's nose? All we have to do is get below that. So this is where it gets, well, how can I test this, right? And this is where it gets tricky, because unless done in a lab, it's kind of hard to do to see this. But I think there's a way to do this. And I outlined this in that article, and I'll just share this now, that it's not dogs under boxes. It's actually on whitetail deer, and it's actually in your hunting situation where you can test these sort of things if you get enough data points. If you get hundreds of data points, it allows you to be able to look at some trends and see if you see some things standing out, if you see any trends or not. And there's a quadrant I'm going to share on YouTube. So if you want to go over there and see it, that basically lets you plot observations and encounters with deer in a 4-quadrant chart. And it kind of lets you see if any of those stand out. And basically the chart is on the x-axis, it's going to be if you use scent control or not. So on one side, on the right side, it's scent control. On the left side, it's no scent control. And then on the y-axis, the left side, you have basically did deer adversely react or not? And right down the middle is this red line, which I call the Dr. Miller threshold, which is below that line, they're not going to smell you. Above it, they are going to smell you. And you can just plot all these encounters and see where they fall. And if all of them are falling in one quadrant, that's telling you something. That's a way to start quantifying, which is what we want to do, results of things, and if certain things work or not. So here's the story about me that I tell with that. So my first 14 years of hunting, I had to play the wind, right? I didn't know anything else. I didn't practice or try any scent control type things. And the results were obvious. They were what you'd expect. Anytime a deer got downwind of me, it would adversely react. So that would be stomping, snorting, changing course. They smelled something, right? Didn't like it. And that's just the way it was those first 14 years. Then I started reading things about and hearing things about, well, maybe you can control this. And so I started testing things out, like putting my gear in bags, in garbage bags, washing it in the right type of detergent, right? Putting it in bags. And just doing some of these simple things, I started noticing a difference. And so I started plotting that data. And, I'd get deer downwind of me where before it was 100%. It was a for sure they were going to smell me and adversely react, and they started not. And that was odd. And so I started this journey of really dialing that regimen in, what I did, and to the point where the last 19 years or so, excuse me, I think I got those reversed. The first 19 years was no scent. The last 14 is. But anyways, the last 14 years, dialing that in to the point where I'm actually surprised now if I do get winded and I know I did something wrong. And so there's a whole process to it. But I've seen after plotting these hundreds of data points before and after that there's major trends. And it's when I do certain things, the deer don't wind me. And they in the past would have, right? You can start to look at trends then, and it starts to become more scientific and a little more data driven, other than just the bias. And bias is a huge thing of believing somebody on TV with a product who's getting paid to tell you something, or somebody that's just saying, hey, you got to play the wind because you can't beat their nose. Well, what's their evidence of this? Have they tried any different or actually tested anything out? And so that's where you have to kind of push the bias aside and say, I'm going to test this myself. And so that's what I saw from mine. Okay, so here is your high IQ moment. If you use cover scents when deer hunting, the question is, how do you know if these are actually working? A lot of products or traditional practices claim to help disguise your scent, but have you tested the results of these in a scientific way? Whether it be smoke as a cover scent, putting pine boughs in your clothes tote, or a spray you bought at the local store, do these really fool a whitetail's nose and keep them from smelling you? The only way to know this is to test this on deer and in the hunting situation, and looking at the data in an unbiased way. Using something like the quadrant analysis I use can help you do this. And a minimum of 30 data points are needed to see any statistical significance at all. This may take years to get, but will help you actually see results in the field versus just listening to the advertiser or your buddy whose claims may or may not be valid. That's just high IQ hunting and is something to think about. And do you know your deer IQ? Do you think you're deer smart? Why don't you take our new and enhanced deer IQ test and find out? This is an in-depth, comprehensive assessment that reveals your strengths, weaknesses, and exactly where to focus to see the biggest results in the woods. It's the only tool out there designed by an educator that can tell you this vital information and is specifically made for those serious about improving as a deer hunter. Check that out, link below, and join the growing group of hunters who have already seen the big benefits of taking it and finding out their true deer IQ. All right, now let's get back to the podcast. So here are some things to think about, and let me tell you a couple stories before I get into some helpful tips of what I think works and what I think doesn't that you should test out. And I would never say, just to believe me, hey, if this stuff's real, you should test it out. You can do the same thing that I did with a chart. You just have to be meticulous and honest about it and go in without bias. Rid yourself of what you've thought before, conclusions you've come to. You go in with an open mind and you just look at the data over time as to what's really going on. A couple quick stories to emphasize this. So this is with my scent control regimen in place. A few years ago, I go into state land in Michigan into a bedding area. I go in knowing my wind is blowing directly to where deer are bedded within 100 yards. As I do this, I'm sitting there for several hours that night. I have groups of deer coming right in my cone of scent. I mean, they're not crossing it. They are in it as they're walking toward me over 80 to 100 yards. The first was this spike buck. Didn't make any reaction. Walked right in my scent cone. Walked under me. I could have shot him. He went out to the field. The next was a group of does. They were in my scent cone for a long time, walking straight toward me. And this is where you know if it's working or not. About 60 yards out, these does stopped, and one of them started moving her nose around to test the wind. She was smelling something, and so they stopped, and she's doing this, and this is how I know they were in my scent cone. right? Sometimes you might not know. You think, oh, they're downwind of me. But when you see something like this, you know they're in your scent cone, and you know you're on that edge. You're on that razor's edge, or what I call the Dr. Miller threshold. Will they react or not? You're on the cusp of that, whether it's enough for them to react or not. And she did that for a minute or two, and I wound up falling below that line. They did not adversely react. They continued to walk the way they were intending to go, walked right under my stand, and kept moving on. They did not adversely react. So in that case, you know that what you did helped you beat that deer's nose. So that's really important data. Then after that, another buck comes out, walks the same way these does did pretty much the same thing, walked by, presented me with a shot. He was I think about a 2-year-old 8-point, and he kept going too. And so a handful of deer that night were downwind to me, none of them adversely reacting because of things I did. And so those are good data points you can log, that these deer were reacting a certain way. You knew they smelled you, and you can start building a case and looking at this scientifically. In 2023, same thing. I'm hunting in state land, a different spot. I had probably 30 deer that night that I saw, and many of them were downwind of me. At one point, there were a group of does about 80 yards from me. They were in my scent cone. They kind of did the same thing as those other does did, where they, thought they smelled something, but they didn't adversely react, and that's huge. They just kept going about their business, which allowed the other deer to feel comfortable. And this is why this is really important, that I think guys should really focus on scent control, because if deer bust, it tells the other deer that something's up, and you're not going to see those deer that come out later, which are usually the older, more mature deer, the bigger bucks. And so you have to get by those deer early on, the ones that come out earlier. If you live in a high deer density state, this is super important, because you can't just think, oh, all I have to do is get past one deer. No, it's a bunch of deer you have to get past, right? And so you're tested multiple times each hunt, and you have to pass that test. I passed the test with those does. I passed the test with some younger bucks that were downwind of me. And finally, right before last light, I see a couple bucks coming my way, and I was set up over a scrape. And it was 2 bucks. One was a young buck, and he came right to the scrape. It was downwind of me, 8 yards. And as the evening is getting cooler, that scent starts dropping. The air gets more dense. It starts dropping. So it was dropping right to him in the scrape, and he did not smell a thing. He just kept moving. And that older buck, this 4-year-old buck, was watching him to see. And that's what they do. They use them. And he passed the test. And so the other buck closed the distance, and I shot him. And that was a Pope and Young buck here in Michigan. And so that's another case where I had to get past multiple deer. If my scent control wasn't there, if I was just playing the wind, it wouldn't have worked. And so that's where I think this is really powerful to check out and to test and to plot these data points. Okay, so here are some helpful tips of what I think works and what doesn't, or what doesn't work that great for me, for you guys to consider. So first, let's look at the air game. You have to eliminate as much scent as possible that you're emitting on the air. The more you cover your body, the better. It's just keeping, skin cells in at least. But, you can look at sprays, like the spray bottle stuff I was talking about at the beginning. Let's look at that. Let's compare that to washing clothes. Let's compare that to ozone, and then activated carbon. Okay, the first thing, let's talk about these sprays, which may or may not work scientifically based on what's in them. But think about this. When you spray something like your backpack or your clothes, your jacket, you're just hitting the surface. This is not like going deep into fibers. It's a surface type thing. And even if it is neutralizing some of these scent molecules, to me, that is minimal effectiveness. It's a surface thing. What about those odor molecules that are deeper in the fibers? You're not touching those. So I don't put a lot of stock into that. I don't use those very much, or don't at all. Again, it's just a kind of a surface thing. So that's my take on that. Washing is much better. Washing clothes as much as possible is a huge way, and scent-free detergent, and sticking those in those bags to keep odors off of them. That is going to be a deep clean. That is getting rid of all those odor molecules deep in the fibers. Another something in your arsenal would be ozone, right? Ozone does destroy organic odor molecules, which is what they are. They're organic molecules. But you have to be careful with this too, because this can be just a surface thing. Depends on how much you soak them and how powerful the ozone unit is. If it's just, kind of a weaker model, which some stuff on the market might be, you're again just doing a surface detox, a surface cleaning. It's not going deep into the fibers of your backpack, of your jacket, of your pants. And this is where the proof is. This is where the proof is. If you have elastic in any of your clothes, your waistband, your cuffs of your shirts, things like that, and it does not destroy that because it destroys rubber, and elastic is rubber. If that doesn't get shot, if that isn't destroyed, then the ozone's not going very deep into those fibers. I use a industrial ozone generator, and it pumps out a lot of ozone, high pressure ozone, that definitely goes deep into the fibers to destroy odor molecules, but it also destroys that elastic. And I found that over the years, I have to be careful. If I put like some gloves in there with elastic around the wrist, it's shot. They're just big and sloppy at that point. That's what you have to be aware of. But if your ozone isn't doing that, you have to wonder, how deep is it really going? Right. So that's something to think about. It's a trade-off there, but I use the high pressure stuff. If I can't wash my stuff, I use that after every hunt. So all my things have been decontaminated. Works really well. Something to consider about ozone. It does work, but how well does your unit actually work? And then the last thing I'm going to address is this bag I showed at the beginning. It was on the thumbnail. This is activated carbon in a stocking, a nylon stocking. You can buy this at any store, and there's a bunch of granules of activated carbon in there. Activated carbon is very scientific. It's known to attract organic molecules, which again, scent are those. And this is used for so many things: water filters, air filters. It filters air. So here's a good example: marijuana production facilities, which I live in a town that has a bunch of them. They stink. But they have to use air filters with activated carbon in them, and it removes those odor molecules. They have to replace them over time because they get, their effectiveness decreases as they're adsorbing those molecules. Adsorb means they're just sticking to the surface, but that is a very known and scientific thing. And so if you use these, they're going to do the same thing. So you can buy that stuff at any store, Walmart, online. It's in fish tank filters, all this stuff. Pet supply stores have it. And if you put it in a little sock like this, that is a scent absorbing vacuum. You can put it in your clothes. I love to put it in my boots. Inside of boots get stinky real quick. You put those in there, give it a little shake, and they are scent free. And the great thing about activated carbon, which is different than stuff you might spray on or whatever, is it attracts odor molecules. It adsorbs it. So the surface is slightly polar. It's going to attract other polar molecules like scent molecules and adhere them to the surface. It works. It works well. And, over time it loses effectiveness, but it takes a lot of time to do that. 1 pound of this, which I'd say this is about 1 pound. If you look at the pore space, which would be the two-dimensional space, if we laid that out, it would cover 125 acres. That's a lot of pore space for adsorption and attracting scent molecules. So all these things can be part of your arsenal to get you to the point where you're just falling below what I call that threshold, that the Dr. Miller line I talked about, where a deer won't adversely react. You're not eliminating all scent molecules in the universe. You're not scent free. You are just doing enough to beat a deer's nose. That's all you need to do. So those are some things to think about. So that's the air game. Now let's talk about the ground game here. with contact. Deer can smell where you've touched. A lot of people overlook this. So this is where rubber is your friend. Okay, rubber is going to be a barrier to keep scent coming off you and onto things you touch. So wearing rubber boots, a lot of times I wear hip boots, especially on public land, because that is more coverage for things I walk through like grasses, keeping my scent off those. But at least rubber boots, never wearing shoes or leather boots, which can leave scent. And I'll prove that to you here in a second with some pictures. For when you're scouting, for when you're hunting, I wear hip boots when I'm hunting. If I can stay warm enough to do it, because that's so important. And I've had deer bucks I've shot, walk down the same trail I did coming in, and never smell me at all. And this was walking through goldenrod and things that are touching me all over. Those, hip boots and things like that really help. And this is when you're placing trail cameras, when you're making mock scrapes for sure, using rubber boots, rubber gloves, never touching those things with your hands, because you want those to be sterile environments with no human scent. And that's super important, mitigating that, and that's where rubber comes in. Those pictures I talk about, so this is interesting. So a couple years ago, I put a lot of trail cameras out, some on state land, and I was in a location I thought was fairly deep and put a trail camera, and I got some interesting pictures. 2 different people walked by this camera in one day, and I'll show these pictures and the dates on them. I might have the timing slightly off, but it's going to be close. 2 people walked by, and I could see one had a pair of shoes and one had a pair of like leather boots. Later that evening, a doe comes out, and I have a picture of her sticking her nose exactly where these guys were stepping. She was smelling them hours and hours later, and she then knew that somebody was back in her domain, walking around where they shouldn't have been, and that is a trigger for her. That's what you don't want. And so if you're not wearing rubber, if you're not being careful with the ground game, you are tipping your hand to the deer, and that's something you really have to look out for and not do. So as we kind of wrap this up, and something to think about, if you start testing this out, again, you just have to be below that line. Eliminate enough of your scent that deer don't adversely react. If you start testing that and you don't, you get a negative response, let's say they do react, don't immediately assume, and this is another thing about being scientific, don't immediately assume that it proved the opposite. Maybe it just proved that you didn't do something effective enough. So take these and say, okay, this is a process I'm working toward. What caused this or that? Because I've had circumstances where I've got winded when I've implemented these things, and I realized that I screwed up one area. So many times it just points toward an area of weakness and lacking, because if you screw up one little thing, they're going to smell you, right? So maybe think of it as a process you're getting toward, and start looking at those data points. See if you see any changes. So something to think about and look at when we look at the science, the testing, and the bias of deer smelling and how to beat a deer's nose. Okay, so here are your high IQ takeaways and challenges. Try to begin looking at science, not the interpreted bias of things like scent control. Ask, is this data that is being presented or just someone's biased opinion? And begin a scent control regimen and start testing it yourself. And you can use my proven and tested one by downloading the free PDF below. Okay, next time we actually start land and food strategies to help you be much more consistent on the land you manage and hunt. If you want to shoot those bucks, not have the neighbors shoot them, you won't want to miss that series. And I'll see you then.